The story of Richard Ramirez is a study in how evil develops. It's a reminder that monsters aren't born fully formed. They're created through a combination of factors: childhood trauma, brain injury, exposure to violence, mental illness, substance abuse, and ultimately, choice. Richard Ramirez chose to embrace the darkness inside him. He chose to believe that he was special, that he was beyond morality, that his desires mattered more than other people's lives. Every step along the way, he had opportunities to choose differently, to seek help, to step back from the edge. He never did. But his story is also about resilience. It's about a city that refused to live in fear forever. It's about survivors who lived to tell their stories and families who fought for justice for decades. It's about a community in East Los Angeles that literally brought a killer to the ground when law enforcement couldn't. Richard Ramirez wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be feared, to be seen as powerful. And in a way, he got his wish. But what he'll really be remembered for is the pain he caused, the lives he destroyed, and the reminder that true evil exists not in the supernatural darkness he claimed to serve, but in the human capacity to choose cruelty over compassion. The Night Stalker is gone, but the lessons from his crimes about trauma, mental illness, the justice system, and the nature of evil itself remain. And maybe that's the only good that can come from such darkness, the knowledge to recognize it, to prevent it, and to ensure that when it appears, we stand together to stop it. Thank you for watching.
Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to find a stranger standing over your bed. His eyes are dark, his smile twisted. Before you can scream, he tells you one thing: I am the Night Stalker. For the residents of Los Angeles in 1985, this wasn't a nightmare you could wake up from. This was Richard Ramirez, a man who turned an entire city into his hunting ground. Tonight, we're going deep into the mind of one of America's most terrifying serial killers. This is the story of the Night Stalker.
Chapter 1: The City of Fear. The summer of 1985 in Los Angeles was unlike any other. While most summers in the city are filled with beach days and barbecues, this one was marked by an overwhelming sense of dread. People stopped opening their windows at night, even in the sweltering heat. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks. Neighborhoods that had never known fear suddenly organized watch groups where residents took turns patrolling their streets until dawn. The reason? A killer was on the loose. But not just any killer. This was someone who seemed to follow no pattern, no logic. He struck in wealthy neighborhoods and poor ones. His victims were elderly couples and young women. He attacked in the valley, in the suburbs, in working-class areas. No one was safe. No neighborhood could breathe easy. The police were baffled. Serial killers typically have a type, a method, something that helps investigators predict their next move. But Richard Ramirez defied every profile. The only consistency was the horror he left behind, and the pentagram, always the pentagram, drawn in lipstick or spray paint on walls and bodies, a calling card from someone who believed he was doing the devil's work. The media called him the Night Stalker, and the name stuck. It captured perfectly the terror of those months, the feeling that darkness itself had become dangerous. Parents kept their children inside after sunset. Single women moved in with friends or family. The city that never sleeps became the city too afraid to close its eyes.
Chapter 2: The Boy from El Paso. But Richard Ramirez wasn't born a monster. He was born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children in a family that struggled with poverty and violence. His father, Julian Ramirez, worked on the Santa Fe Railroad and was known for his explosive temper. When Julian came home angry, which was often, the children learned to make themselves invisible. Richard's mother, Mercedes, tried to shield her children from their father's rage, but she was fighting her own battles. The household was chaotic, unpredictable, and often violent. For young Richard, home was not a place of safety. It was a place where he learned that violence was simply how the world worked. But the violence at home was only part of Richard's story. As a child, he suffered multiple head injuries. One incident involved being knocked unconscious by a swing at a playground. Another time, a dresser fell on him, leaving him with a gash that required stitches. These might seem like ordinary childhood accidents, but research has shown that repeated head trauma, especially in the developing brain, can affect impulse control, emotional regulation, and the ability to feel empathy. Each injury may have been another small step toward the person Richard would become. School was difficult for Richard. He struggled academically and socially. He was small for his age and often picked on. He began to withdraw, finding solace in solitude rather than connection. But it was what happened outside of school that would truly shape his future. Richard had an older cousin named Miguel, who everyone called Mike. Mike had served in Vietnam as a Green Beret, and when he returned to El Paso, he brought the war home with him. Mike would spend hours telling young Richard stories about his time in Vietnam, but these weren't stories of heroism or camaraderie. These were stories of torture, of murder, of power over the powerless. Mike showed Richard photographs, Polaroids he had taken in Vietnam, of women he had tortured and killed. He showed them to this child as if they were vacation photos, pointing out details, describing what he had done. For most children, these images would have been traumatic, horrifying. But for Richard, something different happened. He became fascinated. The relationship between Richard and Mike grew closer. Mike became a mentor figure, filling a void left by Richard's distant and violent father. And then, one day, when Richard was 12 years old, he witnessed something that would cement his path forever. Richard was at Mike's apartment when Mike got into an argument with his wife, Jessie. The argument escalated quickly. Mike pulled out a gun, and in front of 12-year-old Richard, Mike shot Jessie in the face, killing her instantly. Richard stood there, frozen, as his cousin's wife lay dead on the floor. When the police arrived, Richard was still in shock, covered in blood spatter, a witness to murder at an age when most kids are still playing Little League. Mike was arrested and eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was sent to a psychiatric facility, not prison. The message Richard received was clear. You could kill someone and not face real consequences. Violence could be justified, explained away, forgiven. Chapter 3. The Descent. After witnessing his cousin murder his wife, Richard changed. The quiet, withdrawn boy became something darker. He began spending time with his other cousin, also named Mike, who introduced him to a different kind of darkness, Satanism and drug use. Richard became obsessed with Satan and the occult. He listened to heavy metal music, particularly AC/DC's Night Prowler, which would later be found playing at several of his crime scenes. He read about serial killers and studied their methods. He began to see himself as special, chosen for something greater than the ordinary life he saw around him. By his early teens, Richard was using marijuana and LSD regularly. He dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. He took a job at a Holiday Inn, but was fired after he was caught using a passkey to burglarize hotel rooms. It was his first taste of breaking and entering, and he found he had a talent for it. In 1982, at the age of 22, Richard moved to California. Los Angeles seemed to call to him, a city big enough to get lost in, full of opportunities for someone with his particular set of skills. But Los Angeles wasn't a fresh start for Richard. It was where he would fully become the monster he'd been growing into.
In California, Richard lived a transient lifestyle. He stayed in cheap hotels on Skid Row, slept in abandoned buildings, and spent his days shoplifting and his nights breaking into homes. He supported himself through burglary, but he also began using harder drugs. Cocaine became his drug of choice, and he used it heavily, daily. The drug fueled his paranoia and his grandiosity, feeding the belief that he was special, untouchable. He would later say that his crimes began almost by accident. He was burglarizing a home when he found a woman asleep. Instead of fleeing, something clicked inside him. He realized he had power in that moment, complete control over whether this person lived or died, and that power was intoxicating.
Chapter 4. The Night Stalker emerges. On June 28, 1984, Richard Ramirez committed what is believed to be his first murder, though he would never be charged for it. 79-year-old Jenny Vincow was found dead in her apartment in Glassell Park. Her throat had been slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. The brutality of the crime shocked investigators, but at the time it seemed like an isolated incident. It wasn't. It was just the beginning. For nearly a year after Jenny Vincow's murder, there were no similar attacks. Richard later said he was in control, that he could choose when to act. But in March of 1985, something inside him broke free completely. On March 17, 1985, Richard broke into a home in Rosemead where he shot and killed a woman named Dale Okazaki. Less than an hour later, he shot and killed another woman, Silane Yu, as she pulled into her garage. 2 murders in one night, in different cities, with different types of victims. The randomness was terrifying.
8 days later, Vincent and Maxine Zazzara were found murdered in their home in Whittier. Vincent had been shot in the head. Maxine had been stabbed multiple times, her eyes gouged out, her body mutilated. The crime scene was so horrific that seasoned detectives struggled to process it. The attacks continued throughout the spring and summer of 1985. Richard broke into homes in the dead of night, attacking couples as they slept. Sometimes he shot them. Sometimes he beat them with whatever was at hand. Sometimes he stabbed them repeatedly. He sexually assaulted his female victims. He forced some victims to swear their love to Satan before he killed them. And always he left pentagrams on walls, on bodies, on mirrors. His signature, his statement of devotion to the darkness he believed guided him. What made Richard so terrifying wasn't just the brutality of his crimes, it was the apparent randomness. He didn't have a type. He attacked people of different ages, different races, different socioeconomic backgrounds. He struck in different neighborhoods across Los Angeles and surrounding areas. There was no pattern the police could use to predict where he'd attack next or who he'd target. The only consistency was the method of entry. He looked for unlocked windows or doors. In the heat of a Los Angeles summer, people left windows open for air circulation, never imagining they were leaving an invitation for death to enter.
Chapter 5. Inside the Mind.
To understand Richard Ramirez, we have to look at what was happening inside his mind. And what we find there is a complex mixture of trauma, personality disorder, and delusional thinking. From a psychiatric perspective, Richard displayed clear signs of antisocial personality disorder. He had no regard for right and wrong, no empathy for his victims, no remorse for his actions. He saw people not as human beings, but as objects to be used for his gratification. This lack of empathy likely had roots in his childhood trauma and those early head injuries, which can damage the parts of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and moral reasoning. But Richard was more than just antisocial. He also displayed strong narcissistic traits.
He believed he was special, chosen. When he was eventually caught, he showed no shame, only pride. He bragged about his crimes. He flashed satanic symbols at cameras. He reveled in the attention and notoriety. For Richard, being the Night Stalker wasn't something to hide. It was his identity, his claim to fame. And then there was his belief system. Richard genuinely believed he was doing Satan's work. This wasn't just posturing or an attempt to seem scary. He had constructed an entire worldview in which he was a servant of darkness, chosen to bring chaos and death into the world. Some psychiatrists who examined him believed he had elements of psychotic thinking, a detachment from reality that allowed him to commit acts most people couldn't imagine. The drugs didn't help. Richard was using large amounts of cocaine daily by the time his killing spree began. Cocaine can induce paranoia, increase aggression, and lower inhibitions. It can make users feel invincible, godlike. For someone already prone to grandiose thinking and violent impulses, cocaine was fuel on a fire. But here's what's important to understand. None of this excuses what Richard did. Understanding the factors that contributed to his behavior isn't the same as justifying it. Plenty of people experience childhood trauma, suffer head injuries, or struggle with mental illness without becoming serial killers. Richard made choices. He chose to embrace darkness rather than fight it. He chose to hurt rather than to heal.
Chapter 6. The Net Closes. By August 1985, Los Angeles was in a state of panic. The Night Stalker had killed at least 13 people and attacked many more. The police were under enormous pressure to catch him, but they had little to go on. The composite sketch they'd created from witness descriptions hadn't led to an arrest. The pentagram symbol was distinctive, but didn't point to any specific suspect. Then came a break in the case. On August 24, 1985, Richard attacked a couple in their home in Mission Viejo, but this time something was different. The male victim, Bill Carnes, survived being shot in the head. His girlfriend, Inez Erickson, also survived, and she got a good look at their attacker. More importantly, she saw him get into a car and noted the make and model, an orange Toyota. Police put out an alert for the vehicle. It was found abandoned in a parking lot in Rampart. When investigators processed the car, they found a single fingerprint on the rearview mirror. They ran it through the database, and finally, after months of terror, they had a name: Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, known as Richard Ramirez. The police released his photograph to the media. It was everywhere: newspapers, television, billboards. Every person in Los Angeles and the surrounding areas saw Richard Ramirez's face and knew he was the Night Stalker. Richard, meanwhile, was in Arizona, unaware that his identity had been discovered. He'd been on a drug binge and was out of touch with the news. On August 31st, 1985, he returned to Los Angeles. He walked into a liquor store in East Los Angeles to buy a Pepsi and saw his own face on the front page of every newspaper in the rack. Richard ran. He tried to carjack a woman, but she screamed and fought back. He ran into a residential neighborhood, trying to find a car to steal. But the residents of the neighborhood recognized him. They'd seen his face on the news. They knew who he was. What happened next was justice of the most primal kind. A group of residents chased Richard down the street. They caught him and beat him, holding him until police arrived. The Night Stalker, who had terrorized an entire city, was brought down not by sophisticated police work, but by an angry community that refused to let him escape. Chapter 7. The Trial and the Groupies. Richard Ramirez's trial began in 1988, nearly 3 years after his capture. He was charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The evidence against him was overwhelming: fingerprints, witness testimony, surviving victims who identified him. But Richard didn't seem concerned about the evidence. He treated the trial like a performance. He wore sunglasses in court. He flashed a pentagram he'd drawn on his palm at photographers. He yelled, "Hail Satan," in the courtroom. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, he showed no emotion. When he was sentenced to death, he said, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Richard's trial wasn't his behavior. It was the behavior of some of the spectators. Young women attended the trial every day, dressed in black, trying to get Richard's attention. They wrote him letters, sent him gifts, declared their love for him. Some of them had pentagrams tattooed on their bodies in tribute to him. This phenomenon, known as hybristophilia, is the attraction to people who have committed serious crimes. For some of these women, Richard's violence made him attractive, not repulsive. They saw him as misunderstood, as a rebel against society. They romanticized a man who had brutally murdered and assaulted innocent people. Richard eventually married one of these admirers while on death row. A woman named Doreen Leoy, a magazine editor, corresponded with him for years before they married in 1996. She claimed to love him and believed he was innocent, despite his own confessions and the mountain of evidence against him. Chapter 8: Death Row and the End.
Richard Ramirez spent more than 23 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison. During that time, he continued to receive letters from admirers. He granted occasional interviews, always maintaining his persona as a servant of Satan, showing no remorse for his crimes. But time catches up to everyone, even those sentenced to death. In 2013, Richard's health began to decline. Years of drug use had taken their toll. He developed complications from B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer. On June 7, 2013, at the age of 53, Richard Ramirez died at Marine General Hospital. He never faced execution. He died of natural causes, which some saw as a final injustice. The families of his victims had waited decades for his execution, for some form of closure, and instead he simply slipped away in a hospital bed. When news of his death was announced, reactions were mixed. Some of his victims' families expressed relief that he was finally gone. Others felt cheated that he'd never faced the death penalty he'd been sentenced to. And disturbingly, some of his admirers mourned him as if they'd lost someone worth grieving for.